Somewhere beneath the Atlantic, an American attack submarine is running quiet. Inside the sonar room, almost everything arrives as sound. Merchant traffic pulsing overhead, the clicks and moans of marine life. A tanker's propeller, faint and steady, hundreds of miles away. Then, according to the story we're about to investigate, a new contact appears. It doesn't sound like a ship. It doesn't sound like another submarine. And when the American boat changed course, the contact allegedly changed course with it. It stayed there for 3 days. Here's the problem. If the reported speed was real, the thing trailing them should have been anything but quiet. So what exactly was following them? Before we get there, one thing has to be said clearly. This story is usually told as a deathbed confession. A retired sonar operator, decades later, finally describing an encounter he'd kept quiet his whole career. We could not verify a name, a submarine, a patrol date, a location, a rank, an interview, a recording, or a transcript. That doesn't mean nothing happened. It means we can't currently prove what happened, or to whom. So there are two separate questions worth asking here, and they are not the same question. Did this exact encounter happen the way the story claims? And, maybe more interestingly, could something like it happen at all? That second question turns out to be answerable. Let's start there. To understand why an experienced operator might realize something doesn't fit, you have to understand what he's actually doing. A submarine trying to stay hidden mostly listens. That's passive sonar, an array of hydrophones simply receiving whatever sound the ocean delivers, with no signal sent out to give the boat's own position away. The alternative, active sonar, transmits a pulse and listens for the echo bouncing back. It's precise, but it also announces exactly where you are, the acoustic equivalent of shouting into a dark room to see what's there. For a boat trying not to be found, that trade is rarely worth making. So the operator isn't watching a screen the way people imagine radar working, a blip sweeping cleanly around a scope. Much of what he's doing is closer to listening through headphones in a busy room, propellers, pumps, flow noise across the hull, marine life, distant merchant shipping, all layered on top of each other. Over months of training, each of those things develops something like a fingerprint, a rhythm to a particular ship's screws, a pitch to a specific class of reactor pump, a signature filed away and recognized instantly the way you'd know a familiar voice without needing to see the face attached to it, which is exactly why an unfamiliar signature stands out immediately, not necessarily because it's loud, because it doesn't match anything on file. And for an experienced operator, that's often more unsettling than volume ever could be. Now back to the account itself. And here's something worth flagging before we go further. For a story that supposedly describes 72 hours of continuous contact, the surviving version contains remarkably little detail about those 72 hours. No watch schedule, no description of who else was in the room, no account of how the encounter actually ended. We'll come back to that gap because it turns out to matter. According to the circulating account, it starts unremarkably. A new contact, nothing alarming yet. Operators reclassify unknown contacts constantly, and the overwhelming majority turn out to be ordinary. A fishing fleet, a whale pod, a distant tanker running an unfamiliar engine configuration. Then, something changes. The story claims the submarine altered course, and the contact's bearing shifted in a way consistent with something still tracking it, rather than simply drifting past. The boat changed depth. The contact, if the account is accurate, remained. Hour 1, Hour 6, Hour 18. It's still there. By the end of the first day, coincidence gets harder to argue. Two vessels can share a heading by chance. They can even share a heading for a few hours by chance. What's much harder to explain away is a contact that keeps adjusting to match, not once, but repeatedly, across changes the submarine's own crew chose specifically because they weren't predictable in advance. That detail matters more than it might first seem. It's the difference between something happens to be nearby and something is responding. By day 2, if the story is accurate, this is no longer a single strange detection. It is a pattern. And this is exactly where the account grows thin. What happened during the second day specifically? Who else in the crew allegedly heard it? Was command notified? Was any of it logged? The version that survives doesn't say. It jumps from the contact remained to the encounter's most dramatic claim without much in between. That's not proof the middle didn't happen. But a story missing its middle is a weaker kind of evidence than a story that has one. Then, on the third day, the account makes its boldest claim. A contact allegedly moving in excess of 150 knots, with none of the acoustic signature that speed should produce. The speed is extraordinary. The silence is worse. And neither one matters much until we ask whether the number itself can be trusted. To understand why that claim is extraordinary in the first place, you need to understand what water actually does to anything trying to move through it fast. Water is roughly 800 times denser than air. Pushing an object through it at high velocity takes an enormous amount of energy, far more than moving the same object through open sky, and that energy has to go somewhere. Usually, it goes into noise, vibration, and heat radiating off the hull, specifically into something called cavitation. When a propeller, or any surface moving fast enough through water, spins or slices through it quickly, it can drop the local water pressure low enough to form tiny vapor bubbles behind it. Those bubbles collapse almost instantly over and over. Those collapsing bubbles produce a distinctive broadband noise that can make a fast-moving vessel substantially easier to detect, not harder. It's one of the clearest acoustic signatures a fast object underwater can produce, which is exactly why navies spend so much engineering effort trying to delay it. And that contradiction sits at the center of the entire story. A fast object underwater is unusual on its own. A fast object that stays quiet while moving that fast is genuinely difficult to explain. But there is a problem with calling it 150 knots at all. Passive sonar doesn't hand you a speedometer reading. On its own, a hydrophone array mostly gives you bearing, a direction, not a distance, and definitely not a velocity. Turning that into an estimated speed requires something called target motion analysis. Comparing how the bearing changes over time, combining multiple observations from different points along the submarine's own track, and making assumptions about the contact's range and course that can be wrong in ways that compound quickly. A small error in assumed distance translates into a very large error in calculated speed, because the same bearing shift can represent something close moving slowly or something distant moving fast. So a headline number like 150 knots isn't necessarily a direct measurement the way a car's speedometer is. It could be the output of an interpretation, one built on assumptions that, if even slightly off, produce a wildly different answer than what was actually happening in the water. And if the speed may be wrong, the next question becomes even more important. Was the contact's position wrong too? Sound in the ocean rarely travels as one clean straight line. Temperature, pressure, and salinity all alter the speed of sound with depth, creating sound speed gradients that bend or refract an acoustic path instead of letting it travel straight from source to sensor. Those gradients can form ducts that trap and carry sound efficiently over long distances. Shadow zones where a source becomes difficult to detect at all, and convergence zones where sound reappears, unexpectedly strong, far from where it started. On top of that, a single sound can arrive at a hydrophone by more than one route at once, a phenomenon called multipath propagation, some of it bouncing off the seafloor, some reflecting off the surface, arriving slightly out of sync and distorting both apparent bearing and apparent range. All of which means range and source geometry can be far harder to infer than a simple line drawn from sensor to contact would suggest. So here's another hypothesis worth putting on the table. Maybe nothing extraordinary followed the submarine at all. Maybe an entirely ordinary source, distant shipping, a bottom-reflected path, a distant biological sound, arrived distorted enough by multipath and range estimation error to look like something it wasn't. But that explanation runs into another problem. 72 hours of apparent correlation with the submarine's own unpredictable course and depth changes is hard to explain with propagation error alone. A distorted signal doesn't usually follow you on purpose. At this point, two parts of the story have become less certain: speed and location. So what happens when we test the remaining possibilities directly? Cold War navies spent decades building entire systems specifically to find and quietly trail each other's submarines. Extensive undersea listening networks, dedicated hunter submarines, whole doctrines built around exactly this kind of covert pursuit. That's documented naval history. Another submarine fits the behavior. Acoustic trailing was real. Cold War shadowing operations were real. It doesn't fit the performance. A reported 150 knots, sustained for 3 days, with no cavitation signature, doesn't match how any known submarine actually behaves underwater. Conclusion: plausible category, poor match for the reported performance. Some marine animals produce startlingly powerful, low-frequency sounds. Years ago, an unexplained ocean signal, nicknamed the bloop, went undiagnosed, long enough that its unknown origin helped fuel speculation ranging from whales and giant squid to an unknown marine animal. It wasn't an animal. Later, hydrophone observations showed the signature was consistent with Antarctic ice quakes. Enormous ice sheets fracturing and grinding, not anything alive. Biology fits the sound. Powerful, unfamiliar, low-frequency signals genuinely exist in the ocean. It doesn't fit the pursuit. Nothing in the animal kingdom explains 3 days of apparent deliberate tracking behavior at an extreme calculated speed. Conclusion: plausible source for a strange sound, poor match for the alleged behavior. Underwater earthquakes, rock fracture along fault lines, sediment collapse, volcanic venting. All of it generates real acoustic energy. Some of it powerful enough to travel enormous distances through the deep ocean, the same way the bloop itself once did. Geology fits the acoustics. Large-scale seismic and volcanic events genuinely produce loud, far-traveling underwater sound. It doesn't follow submarines. Geological sources are fixed in place. They don't reposition to match a moving vessel's course and depth changes. Conclusion: plausible acoustic source. No mechanism for tracking behavior. Nothing so far explains everything at once. Another submarine fits the behavior, not the performance. Biology fits the sound, not the pursuit. Geology fits the acoustics, not the tracking. That's exactly the kind of contradiction worth sitting with, rather than rushing past toward a tidy answer. There's one more category investigators can neither prove nor easily eliminate: classified technology. Cold War navies genuinely developed acoustic decoys designed to mimic submarine signatures, experimental countermeasures, advanced hull quieting systems, and prototype underwater vehicles, some of which stayed classified for decades, occasionally surfacing in declassified records years or generations later. But that cuts both ways, and this is worth stating plainly. The absence of public information about something is not by itself evidence that a secret version of it exists. It's simply absence of information, worth naming honestly as a real possibility, not worth treating as a quiet conclusion dressed up as a hypothesis. Which brings us to the explanation a lot of viewers came here for. USO simply means unidentified submerged object. Not alien, not otherworldly, just unidentified. A description of our knowledge, not a claim about origin. And if, and this is a real if, every reported detail were simultaneously accurate, the extreme speed, the missing propulsion signature, the depth, the coordinated pursuit, the 72-hour persistence, that combination would represent a genuinely extraordinary underwater contact. But extraordinary performance doesn't repair weak provenance, and that leaves one final possibility. Not a new explanation for the contact, but a problem with the story that contains it. Not the sonar, the confession. Where did this account actually originate? We looked. Here's exactly what we found, and what we didn't. The phrase fast mover has been publicly described by former Navy sonar personnel in connection with brief, difficult-to-classify contacts. Aaron Jive Turkey Amick, a former U.S. Navy sonar operator and instructor, has said publicly in interviews and reporting covered by outlets including Enigma Labs and Marine Technology News in 2025 that unusual, fast-mover contacts occasionally appear on sonar. His own words were that they move so quick that you can't measure the speed because there isn't enough data. That's a real named source, saying something specific and notably more modest than our stories claim. Not a confirmed 150-knot, 3-day pursuit, but an acknowledgement that some contacts move too fast and too briefly to reliably calculate a speed at all. That same source, Amick, has also directly disputed a more dramatic claim attached to this terminology, that the Navy operates a formal, organized, fast-mover program to log and classify these contacts. Speaking on the record with the naval-focused outlet The War Zone in 2019, Amick said plainly, "There is not a fast-mover program, calling elements of the circulating account inaccurate." That specific program claim traces back to a different person. Mark D'Antonio, an astronomer and UFO researcher who has publicly described riding aboard a Navy submarine, hearing a sonar operator call out a contact moving at several hundred knots, and later being told about a fast mover program by name. But D'Antonio's account is evidence that D'Antonio made that claim. It isn't independent evidence the program itself or the underlying event actually exists, and it's directly contradicted by the one named sonar professional who's spoken on the record about it. So here's the honest state of the evidence. Cold War submarine trailing, documented. Unexplained hydroacoustic detections, documented. Sonar operators informally describing unusually fast, hard-to-measure contacts, reported by a named source. A formal program built around them, claimed by one source, directly disputed by the more credentialed named sonar operator. This specific 72-hour 150-knot encounter tied to an anonymous deathbed confession, unverified. Any extraterrestrial origin for it? Entirely speculative. That gap matters. Not because it proves the story false, it might have happened exactly as described, told by someone who genuinely never went on record. But a story we can't trace isn't evidence either way. It's simply a story, and treating it as more would repeat the mistake we flagged at the very start, which means the weakest part of this entire mystery was never the physics. The science gave us ways to test the story. The sourcing did not give us enough to prove it. It's the confession. So let's separate what we actually know from what we don't. What we know: submarine sonar can detect distant, difficult-to-classify sources. Ocean acoustics are genuinely complicated, capable of bending and misdirecting sound in ways that fool trained listeners. Cold War navies spent decades tracking each other acoustically, for real. And unexplained hydroacoustic signals have existed, and sometimes later turned out to have a mundane cause. What we don't know, whether this specific 3-day encounter happened as described, whether 150 knots was ever actually measured rather than inferred, and whether the deathbed confession behind it can be independently authenticated at all. The source is weak. The physics are genuinely interesting. Some components of the story are plausible on their own, others remain extraordinary. The evidence doesn't currently allow us to close the case in either direction. So maybe the most interesting mystery here was never what followed the submarine. Maybe it's whether anything followed it at all. Because somewhere between what the ocean actually does, what a sonar operator thinks he's hearing, and what survives decades later as a story worth retelling, there is a gap. And sometimes that gap runs deeper than the ocean itself. Like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating story from our deep ocean.